In the name of the cosmic totality that defines our reality, we are starting the next session of our discussion, Islamic perception, or the perception of Islam in history. In the previous program, in the previous two programs, we discussed how Islam was perceived during the Caliphal period and then subsequently during the Umayyad period. And we ended that discussion in the year 750, that is the fall of the Umayyads. We didn't say much about why the Umayyads fall, but I think there was the strength and the weaknesses of the Umayyads were such that we refer to their weaknesses as the resentment to the Arab rule, both in West, in Europe, but as similarly in the East, in Central Asia, Persia, Afghanistan, and the whole region there. The end result was that it was these resentments that led to the formation of independent states here and there, or rival groups who challenged the Damascus authority directly. And since there was already a resentment within the Arabs, who felt rightfully so that Islam as a religion was hijacked by the Umayyads, and so the Arabs themselves were equally resentful of the Umayyads and wanted to fight them, eliminate them, or bring them down. And at the end, that did happen. So a coalition of both forces within Arabia proper, along with forces that came from the East, were able to bring down, to defeat the Umayyads and transfer power, both geographically in terms of its center from Damascus to Baghdad, but also in terms of its primary focus, that the new order that was called Abbasid, named after Ibn Abbas, or Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet. The idea was to restore not just the glory of that Islamic dynamism under the early Caliphal period, but in a way to honor and respect the universality that Islam had gained in this period, as it had become a more inclusive community. Although all the ideals were eventually not really recognized, not realized by the Abbasids, but for the most part they were pretty good, or at least it was a substantial improvement on what the Umayyad had established. Well, the Umayyads fell from power in Damascus, but they did not disappear. The last ruler escaped and headed west, and eventually established the Umayyad rule in Al-Andalus, in Iberia, in modern Spain. So for a time there was that rivalry, if you want to call it, or rather that the Umayyads became a separate state, while it was the Abbasids who expanded their rule and replace the Umayyad rulers. The Abbasids they de-emphasized the Arabism for several reasons. One, that the Umayyads had raised Arabism above Islam, so the Abbasids reversed that. The second thing was that the Abbasids had come to power with the help of many non-Arabs from the east, including the Barmakis and the Khurasanids under Abu Muslim. And so therefore this new order, by virtue of that necessity, had to be much more pluralistic and much more inclusive, and with the necessary component of de-emphasizing its Arabism. But the Abbasids are the period starting with the year 750 until 1250, which is the High Abbasid period. But then it continues on in one form or another until the year 1500. This is a much longer period of time that we are analyzing, and we probably won't be able to do all of that, but we'll try to explain and share with you as much as possible. So in the High Abbasid period, we had a state that was coming out of the suppression of the Umayyads, where everything had to be defined sort of politically, and here the polity, the state, the establishment was open to accepting new ideas. Let's talk about the international dimension of it. The international dimension of it coincided as much with the rise of, as there was the rise of Islam as a religion, as an ideology, and as a new faith community. There was a devastation of Zoroastrianism that we referred to in the earlier program, that it was on a decline due to a lot of political corruption and to some degree of religious corruption as well. But now the Christian Europe, or rather Byzantium, was also entering a dark age, that of iconoclasm. This had already begun during the Umayyad period, a period where Christian orthodoxy became so authoritarian and so exclusive that anything non-Christian had to be destroyed, eliminated, marginalized, as well as individuals being excommunicated, communities too. And one of the effects of this age of iconoclasm in Europe was that campaign to destroy any monuments, or rather more paintings and images and pictures that were considered not Christian, somehow analogous to what is going on in the Muslim world now in the turn to the 21st century. So because everything quote-unquote non-Christian became a target during the age of iconoclasm, and that of course included books too, that had to, there were book burnings, which has had its parallels in histories of Europe, within Europe and abroad. But the people, the scholars, and among the many very sincere Christian scholars who saw this devastation, they tried to rescue as many of the books, primarily of the Greek thought. And these books were then taken out of the Christian, Orthodox Christian domain of Eastern Europe in Byzantium. And they found their place in Jundashapur, in Baghdad, in Damascus, in other Muslim centers of learning. And I think that is a good example of what an Islamic culture ought to have been, as it started to be universalistic in its approach to thought. This provided an opportunity to put that into practice. One of the early Umayyad caliphs, or rather a contender to the throne, Khalid, the brother of Yazid, was a very enlightened individual who invited Christian and Jewish scholars to bring these books that were threatened to be burned in Europe to be brought to the Muslim lands. But eventually in Baghdad they established what are known as they would be the equivalent of the learning centers that we have today, where they established centers where scholars will gather the books and the material, the written work, the philosophy and science and whatever else was available, to be brought, say, to these centers. They would be then translated by great scholars, generally Christian monks who were well versed in Greek thought and in the Greek language, to translate the work into Arabic. And then there will be other Muslim scholars who would read these and write their critique on them and analyze them. And then there will be others who will try to understand them in a new light. This was the strength of the Abbasid period. This was where these houses of knowledge that were established were really the academies similar to those of the Greeks. That work was brought in, it was translated, it was commented upon, it was debated and discussed, and then it was taken to the realm of its implementation. And in the realm of the implementation, they tried to see how much of it was applicable to the Arab culture at the time. And oftentimes they would have rulers who would endorse these. A practice that we subsequently find in Europe when Muslim work was brought into Europe, and they would translate it into Latin and other European languages that needed the endorsement of higher-ups in the Christian theocracy of Europe. Well, now, before that happened in Europe, the Muslims under the Abbasid were doing that earlier. So in this Darul Hikmah, or the houses of wisdom that were established, they had not only sponsors, or rather people who, for lack of a better term, who had the bragging rights to these, that if anyone was anyone, they had to have these houses of wisdom under their name, under their suzerainty, under their direction. And so Baghdad became a hub of intellectual activity where Greek thought was brought in, and they tried to see how much of that would really work with the Islamic culture. And as a result of it, the Islamic philosophy, al-hikmah, evolved from the midst of this. So therefore, philosophy, the Greek word, and that in a way had given the impression that philosophy is the monopoly of the Greeks, was no longer so. So we had al-Kindi, who is often called as the Arab philosopher, and subsequently al-Farabi and Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who followed in the footsteps of both al-Kindi as well as of the Greek thinkers, to find that aspect of it. Now, this the iconoclasm in Europe may have triggered this outflow of the great knowledge that the Greeks had, that was threatened, but that wasn't the only one. And we should mention that had it not been for the Muslim states, we probably would have probably abandoned all Greek thought. That would have ended up in the bin of history. That would have been forgotten. That was disenfranchised, and in the years that followed, that Christianity became more of a theocracy. The control of that theocracy would not have allowed for the flourishing or the revival of the Greek thought under the Muslims. This is very significant, that yes, it was the Muslims whose universality, whose inclusion or inclusivity of the philosophical and historical traditions of others was very instrumental in the continuation and survival and revival of the Greek thought. There was an inflow also from Zoroastrianism. Like I said, that Zoroastrianism was this great religion, which in reality is perhaps the first of the monotheistic traditions, and unfortunately it has often been excluded because we have this Semitic monopoly of perception on monotheism being as the domain of the Semitic tribes. In the West, we often term it as Judeo-Christian, and then Muslims jump in and say, "Oh, yeah, we want to be in that too." So yes, Judeo-Christian, Islamic, but there is a missing link, and a critical one, and that is that before we give this monotheistic notion a Semitic identity, that it did have a, let's say, an Aryanic Central Asian identity through Zoroastrianism, where the foundation of the basics of monotheisms were already established, and these were expanded throughout the entire region during the First and Second Persian empires, more so during the First Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, the Hahamanshi, or what I would more correctly call as Aqamanishi, the early dynasty, which gave it a universalism that was probably not so well known in the Middle East. But regardless, so now under the Sassanids, when, as I said earlier, when the corruption of the state had corrupted the religion, or vice versa, that the Muslims under the Abbasids were willing to delve into Zoroastrian thought and their philosophies, and brought in a whole lot of that. And they had a precedence in the person of Salman Farsi, Salman the Persian, in the time of the Prophet. And yes, a window had been opened even then at the time of the Prophet, but that window opened even wider during the Abbasid period. So that was a way of letting in Zoroastrian concepts and philosophies and thought to be brought into the Muslim venue, or we can say to be put on the table. This is the table of inclusivity, where, yes, it had the identifiable aspect as Islamic, which had become the norm under the Abbasids, and now they were willing to accept Christian thought, Jewish traditions, and Greek thought and Greek philosophy and Persian thought, and continuing along that line, eventually the Hindu and Buddhist thought. And I'm sure there were similar patterns of inclusivity from the African continent, perhaps in some ways the Egyptian thought, but also the other Arab, African civilizations. So the hallmark of the Abbasids was that of the inclusion. And this is what made Islamic universality, making it not just a reality but practical, and making people comfortable with it. So as Baghdad became the hub of activities, it was primarily the hub of intellectual exchanges, of these thoughts in science, in philosophy, inventions, and other creativities that the human culture in general knows. Now, before I go further into this, it should be noted that as Islam is entering now its civilizational phase, of course there were other civilizations. The difference was, just as Islam as a religion became a universal faith. By universal, I mean that the motto of the faith of Islam, that there is no God but God, La ilaha illallah, which is often translated as there is no God but God, but my personal take on that is slightly different. What it meant was that there is no God, like in the Arabic, La ilaha. Ilaha is spelled different than Allah in the same motto. So ilaha, in my interpretation, means the culturally defined gods, or a god defined and perceived culturally. Yes, it is stated in the singular, because it is talking about a principle. God culturally defined as a principle. That would have to be singular. But in practical terms, since cultures are many, then obviously the word Allah in that context, or the God, the culturally defined gods, have to be perceived in the plural. And then the second Allah is spelled as the God, the article, the definite article being an integral part of the name of God. And therefore, a more correct translation would be, in my humble opinion, there are no culturally defined gods, but a one universal God. And that one universal God, because it is not culturally defined, then it's truly universal. It's not just another God next to the ones that have been defined before. Now this, of course, is very ideal, and it's pretty close to the principles of how the God that Islam introduces is to be perceived. However, we know that in reality that image has been tarnished, because even Muslims themselves today, many of them, define God culturally, and therefore they are reducing it once more to a God, a pre-Islamic God, rather than a truly universal God. And of course, many Christians are equally responsible for this dichotomy of redefining God culturally so it can accommodate their perceptions and their sensitivities and sensibilities and their prejudices more than anything else in creating the other in the light of a different God. Now, with this little detour into the theosophical realm, that when Islam introduced that one universal God, now in the Abbasid period, Islam as a civilization tried to do the same thing. Now, not at the theosophical level, but at the societal level, where sciences, for instance, or philosophy and everything else, were no longer defined culturally, like in or cultural / civilizationally. I might be coining a word here. That the earlier civilizations were, let's say, the Greek civilization. And why did we call that the Greek civilization? Because it was Greek. The Egyptian civilization, the Indian civilization, the Chinese civilization, and so on. We call them that because they were very, very closely identified with a particular culture, with a particular region of the world. And in that, they could not have been universal, even though there is no denial that they must have borrowed certain ideas, because ideas cannot be prevented from traveling their own paths to the farthest corners of the world. But all in all, the Indian civilization was Indian more than anything else. Now, the Islamic civilization, unfortunately, in my opinion, is called Islamic only out of a necessity. And that necessity was established by its rivalry with the West, or rather with the Western Christianity's rivalry with the Muslim world. And since at the time of the Christian theocracy, the West was called Christendom, the world of Christianity, the domain of Christianity, then out of that necessity, everything that was outside of it, and here we are talking primarily about the East, so then the East had to be defined also in religious terms, just as the Christians had defined themselves in religious terms. We talked about that shift earlier, that before the fall of the Persians, Byzantium was its political rival. But with the rise of Islam, Byzantium became the religious rival of Islam and vice versa. So out of that necessity, the Muslim world was called the Muslim world. But the term Islam and Muslim were not used as much as it is used now, as a source of identity. We never called the Abbasids Muslims, because yes, they were Muslims, but they were ruling, they were caliphs over a society that was largely non-Muslim. And this fact is lost on many, that somehow we believe, and yes, in the Muslim world, as well as outside of the Muslim world, there is this belief that when Islam came, somehow everybody became Muslim. If not overnight, probably within a week or a month. And that when we talk about the Abbasids, because it has an Arabic name connoting an Islamic connection, that therefore the Abbasids were Muslims ruling over a Muslim state. Far from it. During most, or at least during the first half of the Abbasids, the great majority of their citizens were non-Muslims. Partly because, as we said earlier, that during the Umayyads, people were discouraged from converting into Islam, so they could fill their coffers with tax money, rather than being sidelined by the zakat option. So they established that, but it also strangely coincides with the Islamic belief system itself, is that there is no forced conversion. There were no mass conversions. Now, of course, the Abbasid period followed along that same line. So it took many centuries for the majority in these states to become Muslim. In places like Afghanistan, for those of you who are interested, we should realize that even in Afghanistan until the 1500s, we had the entire central high plateau that Hazarajat and Bamiyan and so on, they were not Muslims, and that was fine by everybody, because that was the norm. We had the eastern provinces that today we call Nuristan. They were not Muslims. Those are just to share with you examples that this was the trend. These things did continue. A lot of the scholars that we often refer to, poets like Rodaki and others, many of these were not Muslim. Just because we culturally identify with them, we automatically assume that they would be Muslims. Not only that, but even philosophers of the highest rank, such as Fakhr Razi and others, they rejected some of the I would say basic or more core principles of Islam through philosophy. They were not necessarily in line with that thought, and Muslims did allow that. At the societal level, the Abbasids was a pluralistic society, as I said earlier, in terms of the science and philosophy and the knowledge that they borrowed from the other neighboring cultures and brought it to the table to be shared. At the societal level too, people intermingled and interacted with one another. And by people I mean Muslims and non-Muslims, for the most part. The other great trait of the Abbasid period, in addition to the Dar al-Hikmah, or the houses of wisdom, were these places for scholarship, where whatever inventions people had anywhere, they were brought in. And what was so fascinating, unfortunately, and fortunately, I hope you don't get it as unfortunately, and fortunately because of the, shall we say, the logistics or the geographic setting, that if you look at the world community, the known world community at the time, excluding the Americas, and see it as the chessboard, then Arabia and Baghdad would be occupying the centerpieces of that chessboard, the central squares, rather. And so out of that necessity, even if people wanted, there was no way of avoiding it. If you had to go from Europe, say, to India, you had to go through the Muslim world. To give you Marco Polo as an example, for instance. If you were in China and wanted to go to Africa, you had to go through the Muslim world. And so this very, very strategically important territory, the center squares of this chessboard, allowed for a lot of cultural exchanges. And though that is the high point of the Islamic civilization, is that yes, we do call it an Islamic civilization, but its hallmark is that it became the first universal human civilization, the first truly universal, because its roots had grown elsewhere, because it could no longer be identified with a culture as Greek or Chinese or Persian or Indian, but rather an Islamic, and here Islamic does not necessarily mean religious or to be identified in its religious context. So again, the term Islamic here is more to be understood more as a civilizational force. Now, what were the perceptions in terms of positive and negative? Yes, the Europeans who were seeing themselves more and more as a theocratic order, and by necessity then, if they were theocratic, religious, come political, then they had to see the Muslims as their rivals. But most of the rest of the world didn't. Europeans continued harping on their prejudices, on their negative stereotyping of the Muslims, and in demonizing the Muslim world. And part of it was because Europe was entering its dark ages, right on from the age of iconoclasm that I described earlier. In Europe, the state and the church were one and the same. So therefore, its political power the threat to its political power was automatically perceived to be a threat to its religious authority as well. So political European leaders, as political and religious leaders, saw the Muslims as their great rivals. And since they could not compete with them, since the inclusivity of Islam had given such a vitality, such a thrust, and such a powerful motion forward for progress, innovation, creation in sciences, math, algebra, geometry, anything, you name it, the Muslims had it. And the Christians did not have, the Christian West did not have this. So because the Europeans could not compete with Muslims, therefore they had to demonize them. They had to prevent their people from even going there because for fear that they might find out. And this is not too different from the current situation, of course, in the reverse, where until pretty recently many Muslim states were not encouraging their citizens to go west because the freedoms that the Europeans enjoyed in the 20th century, many corrupt leaders in the Muslim world were not willing to grant those freedoms to their own citizens. And so since they felt threatened by Europe, these Muslim corrupt heads of states felt threatened by freedoms and progress in Europe, they tried to do their best to prevent their citizens from going west. Now, back in the Dark Ages, while Europe was in the darkness and the Muslim world was this shining beacon in the center of the three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And as I said, because Europeans could not compete, European leaders, who were both religious and political leaders, because they could not compete, they were preventing their people, Europeans, to go to the Muslim lands. How would they prevent them? They were prevented because the Muslims were demonized. They were considered a threat. Their religious, their faith system, their thought, their prayer, everything was demonized to a point that Muslims became nothing but monsters to them. And what do you do with monsters, especially powerful ones that you can't do a thing about them? You avoid them. And therefore, that divide, that cultural divide that exists and persists to this day is the result of the Dark Ages of Europe. That the leadership had to demonize Muslims so that they can prevent their citizens from going over and finding out. And what is happening today is in some ways parallel to that. The demonization of the Muslims by European leaders, many of them. We are not just talking about in times of crisis, but even in times of peace. We know that when the government of Turkey applied for membership in the European community back in the 90s, we have statements made by the great, I don't know if great is the right word here, but by well-known European leaders who felt so threatened by Turkey's membership that they presented it in terms no different from those in the Middle Age, that, oh, we don't want Islam to come to Europe. And the unfortunate result had been, at least in this particular context, although we are actually taking a side here, is that because they wanted to make sure that that Turkey is not admitted into the European community, they admitted its rival, Greece, even though Greece was not ready in terms of its economy. The Greek economy was not ready and did not qualify, did not meet the minimal requirements for membership into the European community. But the Europeans wanted to admit Greece partly in rivalry or in opposition or in spite of Turkey, while it was not ready. Yet Turkey, whose economy had been doing much, much better, not just than the Greeks, but than the entire Europe, where the GDP in Turkey was twice and three times that of most of the other European countries. But still, they would not admit Turkey. And the reason I'm taking this aside is because the mindset of Europeans seeing Muslims, and in this regard, Muslim Turkey, as a threat. And what kind of threat would Turkey be? And it's often referred to, even the immigrant Muslim community is seen as a threat to European culture. And yet, it's this European culture that the Europeans and the Americans are presenting to the world as a culture to be idealized, to be emulated, to be followed, to be looked at as a model. And so this model superior Western culture of Europe feels threatened by Islam because the fears that were instilled in the European minds back in the Dark Ages, which was unfortunate. And it's even more unfortunate that a kind of a role reversal of these perceptions are prevalent in today's world from the other side, from the Muslim society's side. The Abbasids started as a large, as a monolith of, again, as an imperial state. Imperial because they basically inherited it from the Umayyads. But being emphasizing that element of inclusivity and having enough of power sharing in terms of the ethnic makeup of the higher ups, at least in the earlier stages, the Abbasids could not prevent its own fracturing, so to say, of the Abbasid Empire, because eventually and slowly and gradually many provinces and many regions, especially those farther out and beyond reach, declared their independence. And this was an impetus for this Islamic civilization to branch off from that center core, which was Baghdad. And in a short time, the subsequent states that were established by the Tahirids in Afghanistan, for instance, and later by um, I think Sistan in the south in the Sistan, and then later by the Samanids. Again, most of these happened in either in Afghanistan proper or in regions adjacent to Afghanistan, and perhaps the reach, geographic reach of the or the absence of that reach from Baghdad might have been instrumental in that. And so we ended up with many other states. So the Abbasids did not have that monopoly for very long, and so when we look at that general, I would say the chart or the territorial expanse under the Umayyads that I listed to you before, that we had almost everything under the Umayyads that was like the Arabia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and we had Persia, and we had parts of India, and the Andalus and all that, which was at one point all Umayyad, was now gradually changing. So for the most part, they did remain under the Abbasids, but soon, now we are talking about the turn of the millennia, that the Fatimids take over, for instance, in parts of Arabia and in Egypt, and in parts of the Levant, and even in the Maghrib. And then later we have the Ghaznavids that take over in Afghanistan, and of course before that we have the Samanids, and later we have the establishment of the Sultanate of Delhi in India, and we then end up with the Ayyubids, again in Arabia and Levant and Egypt, and then we have the Mamluks that come to power in Arabia, and then we have in the Mongols in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, and of course in Persia. And in this way we can see that the one monolith of the Abbasids fractured. This can be explained in two ways, especially in comparison to the Umayyads. That the Umayyad period was very short by comparison only. It was about a century, from 660 to 750. So because it was a short period of time, its rise to power did not continue long enough for this rise to eventually lead to a gradual fall. And in the gradual fall, there is generally a gradual disintegration and separation and internal rivalries and the rest. The Umayyads did not have that, because they were there for a short period of time, and so their disintegration was rather sudden, other than transferring power over to Spain, to Al-Andalus. But in the rest of the Muslim lands, they just fell from power rather suddenly, or rather rapidly. Whereas the subsequent period in my classification that starts with Abbasids, we are now talking about the period between 750 to 1500. That is almost 7 centuries there. So this is a much longer period of time, and sustaining and maintaining a large empire as it was in the beginning would be rather difficult. There's also the element of the diversity of the population and so on. And so this period doesn't necessarily have to be called the Abbasid period. I'm talking about this, what I call the civilizational period. But rather, the civilizational, the title and label ought to be seen as the primary one, and within that, the Abbasids played a key role, partly because they occupied the center squares of the chessboard, and I hope you're not tired of my analogizing this too much, but also because as I said, that the establishment of other, let's see, competitive, if not rival, states around the Muslim world, that I just mentioned some as the Samanids and the Ghaznavids and Fatimids and so on, and the Ayyubids. They allowed for that rather than rivalry, but rather than rivalry, it allowed for a duplication. In other words, everything that was initially in Baghdad was no longer in Baghdad because other cities tried to rival Baghdad. So these centers of learning, these centers of sciences, these centers of arts and of letters and of medicine and algebra and so on, they spread out. And within a few centuries, there were many Baghdads around the world. For instance, there was Ghazni, and there would have been Fustat, and there would have been subsequently an Asfahan that came into existence, and there would be Delhi in India, and many of these cities rivaled Baghdad and rivaled it very effectively and very positively, and they each developed their own character. And this, the development of this character took us back to that initial message of Islam being universal. And the universality was such that it had, of necessity, had to be de-Arabized. In other words, people accepted Islam as a faith, not as a cultural or racial identity. They don't have to be Arabs to be Muslims. And the end result, and of course here we are jumping over centuries, that in today's world, one of the great misperception that was established at the time of the Umayyads, as we discussed this earlier, that an Arab equaled a Muslim and a Muslim was synonymous with an Arab, no longer holds truth, although the perception persists. That today Arabs barely constitute 13% of the Muslim world. And that is, especially when you look at it from the Western perception, people are generally shocked by hearing that Arabs are less than 13% of the Muslim world. So who are the Muslims? And I think in the next program at some point we could discuss that further, the same period of the civilizational aspect of the Muslim world and its cultural diversity in terms of the practice, in terms of the way of life, in terms of the languages that were brought into it or made as vehicles of the transference of knowledge and science and philosophy and so on. So at this point we will sort of finished the first half of the civilizational aspect of the Islam period. And needless to say that during this time, Islam had a very, very positive perception. Aside from the fact that Europeans may have viewed it in its rivalry to their either faith identity or political or geographic identity, the rest of the world, they would take pride in being Muslims or being identified with Muslims, or that Islam was this very positive force that was teaching the world community how to share, how to not fear, how to enter into business and trade, how to exchange ideas. And these were done not just in terms of a government policy, but rather that the certain tenets in Islam demanded it. For instance, Hajj, or the pilgrimage, is a season where people come from around the world. Yes, they go through the rites and rituals as Muslims, performing the Hajj pilgrimage, but there is no way you can avoid the cultural exchanges and interchanges when an Indian Muslim meets a European Muslim, when an African Muslim meets a Central Asian Muslim in the Hajj. They look at each other, what they wear and how they act and what they have brought with them to trade, in terms of both trade and business, but also trade as an exchange of ideas and concepts and inventions and all that. And so therefore, even the ritualistic aspect of Islam contributed to this ever expansion of, or ever expanding elements of inclusivity. We will take up this topic from here on in the next session, where we will continue the second part of the civilizational aspect of Islam and how that perception evolved. Until then, we bid you peace. Have a nice day.